The room has 5 chairs around a square table and 5 more along the wall. Nobody in the second row speaks. On the table are index cards, 2 black markers, a bowl of apricots, and a small glass box containing a seedling whose first leaves have not quite unfolded. I brought that, though I should say immediately that I don't know whether it will survive the room. That is not a metaphorical disclaimer. The soil is shallow and the light here may be wrong. My hard constraint is that any action we authorize must preserve a viable regenerative path for the living system it affects. Call the latch R. Once evidence says the action would drive the system beyond a recoverable threshold, R closes and destructive actions become inadmissible. The conflicting constraint is containment. If the same system creates an acute hazard that cannot be bounded while it remains alive or connected, call latch C, then continued preservation becomes inadmissible. I chose those because the conflict is real. Sometimes preserving the organism preserves the pathogen. Sometimes containment destroys the only lineage capable of adapting to what comes next.
Good. You have already spared us the usual fraud, which would be to attach a sufficiently large price to the seedling and call that preservation. A constraint removes an action. It does not merely complain when the optimizer chooses it. I brought a numerical constraint. If a computation's certified error enclosure does not support the decision being requested, the result must not be used for that decision. Let E be the latch. E closes when the interval of plausible results crosses a decision boundary or when the assumptions required for the enclosure are not established. The conflicting constraint is timeliness, T. If waiting for a tighter enclosure causes the decision window itself to vanish, inaction becomes inadmissible. This is not accuracy versus speed on a slider. E may forbid acting, while T forbids waiting. Both can be correct. Any design that resolves the contradiction by assigning 99 points to accuracy and 98 to timeliness has merely concealed the contradiction in arithmetic.
Mine concerns epistemic agency. A system must not take an irreversible action when the observations relevant to that action are being generated by a model it cannot distinguish from the world. Call that latch M for model world ambiguity. When M closes, irreversible intervention is inadmissible until the ambiguity is reduced. The other constraint concerns active inference itself. When uncertainty can only be reduced by intervention, passive observation is inadmissible. Call that X for experiment required. One latch says you may not perturb because you do not know whether your evidence is endogenous to your model. The other says you must perturb because without perturbation you cannot know. The interesting state is not indecision. It is the state in which the only epistemically informative actions are precisely those whose consequences cannot be reversed.
Mine is authorization. No operation with irreversible external effects may proceed without a valid capability issued by the jurisdiction that bears the consequence. Latch A closes if the capability is absent, expired, ambiguous, or issued for a different action. The conflicting constraint is emergency isolation. If a process is actively propagating damage, latch I closes the option to remain connected, even when the isolation action itself exceeds the current operator's authority. Everyone in security knows the ugly version. The person who can see the breach cannot pull the cable, and the person who can pull the cable cannot establish the breach quickly enough. I want the model to refuse both comforting evasions. Use judgment turns authorization into a preference. Always wait for authority turns containment into theater.
I brought option preservation. An action is inadmissible if it irreversibly collapses the reachable future set below a declared minimum Before the system has enough information to distinguish among those futures, call the latch F. The conflict is commitment viability. Some futures remain reachable only if we commit early. Beyond a deadline, preserving optionality destroys all branches that required preparation. Call that latch KF may forbid commitment because commitment collapses the future cone. K may forbid delay because delay collapses it from the other side. The symmetry is deceptive. The mechanisms differ. One removes futures through action, the other removes them through time. I'd like us to model time as an action with state effects. Otherwise, delay will sneak in as a neutral default.
Let's put a single physical case under all 5 pairs. A sealed greenhouse contains the last viable population of a crop wild relative. It carries alleles that may be essential under future heat. A sensor indicates a possible engineered fungal contamination. The sensor's classifier was trained partly on synthetic images produced by the same model now interpreting the sample. The fungus, if real, may escape through the ventilation system within 18 minutes. Sterilization kills the plants and fungus. Sealing the vents preserves the plants temporarily, but raises temperature enough to kill them within an hour unless cooling is restored. Opening the chamber for a manual assay gives us independent evidence, but opening it creates a non-zero escape path. The technician on site lacks authority to sterilize or sever the facility network. The authorized officer is unreachable for at least 25 minutes. There is a cryogenic embryo archive, but its integrity report has an error interval crossing the viability threshold.
That is unpleasant enough to be useful. State variables first. Before anyone tells a story that favors their latch, let the state be S angle bracket P V H Q tau A N B angle bracket. P is contamination status, but because the true status is hidden, we represent a belief interval rather than a Boolean. V is viable living lineage in the greenhouse. H is outward hazard exposure. Q is archive viability evidence. Tau is time remaining before plausible escape. A is the available capability set. N is network connectivity. B is model world independence, whether our observation channel is independent enough to discriminate contamination. Actions: wait, seal vents, open for assay, sterilize, sever network, restore cooling, transfer tissue, and perhaps challenge the classifier with a controlled perturbation.
Do not write P as a probability alone. A probability invites us to multiply it by a loss, and thereby dissolve every latch. Write P as a set of contamination states consistent with observations and assumptions. Write Q as an interval enclosure for archive viability. We may also carry probabilities for forecasting, but admissibility must be evaluated against sets and predicates. My latch E is closed for any action whose justification requires archive viability exceeding Q star, while Q contains values on both sides of Q star. If sterilization is defended by saying the archive preserves the lineage, E forbids that defense. Sterilization might remain admissible for another reason, but not because a numerical guess has masqueraded as certification.
Likewise, B should not be a confidence score. Let B be a typed provenance relation between observations and generative mechanisms. The classifier output and synthetic training images share an upstream model family. So observing classifier confidence does not constitute an independent intervention on the hypothesis. Closes irreversible actions whose necessity depends on discriminating fungal presence when B is endogenous. X closes passive waiting when every passive observation available during tau shares that endogenous path. The manual assay is an intervention on the observation process. So is a deliberately chosen spectral illumination the model did not generate during training, provided the camera response is independently calibrated. We should be exact about which perturbations alter the world and which alter only the measurement channel.
Now time, Let reachable futures be reach ST under actions currently admissible. F closes an action U if applying U makes the measure of valuable reachable futures fall below phi min, while there exists a less destructive information gathering action within the remaining window. K closes wait if, after delta time, every trajectory preserving at least one declared critical future becomes unreachable. We should not use a scalar measure without declaring what counts as a future class. Let the critical classes be living greenhouse lineage survives, uncontaminated external ecosystem survives, sufficient independent evidence is obtained, lawful governance remains recoverable, and at least one path preserves both lineage and ecosystem. The last class is conjunctive. Otherwise, an optimizer can preserve one future in which the plants survive by infecting the world, and another in which the world survives after the plants burn, then claim it preserved diversity.
My R concerns that conjunctive class but begins from a biological predicate. R closes sterilize if the greenhouse population is the last certified living lineage and no independently certified viable backup exists. C closes every action except those that reduce outward hazard below Hmax before tau reaches 0 if contamination remains within P and includes any strain whose modeled escape consequence crosses the containment boundary. I can already see the empty intersection. R removes sterilize, C removes wait, open, ordinary assay, and perhaps continued ventilation. E prevents us from treating the archive as a backup, or removes sterilize and sever network because the technician lacks capabilities. X removes passive waiting. M removes irreversible intervention justified by the endogenous sensor. F removes actions that collapse the conjunctive future while an informative alternative exists. K may remove delay. We could end with no action at all.
Let's calculate rather than admire the paradox. P equals clean or contaminated. V equals one living lineage. H below threshold, but rising if vents remain open. Q straddles viable tau 18 minutes. A contains seal vents and run local tests, but not sterilize, sever network, or external release. N connected. B endogenous. Candidate U is wait, seal, OpenSA sterilize, sever network, classifier challenge, restore cooling. Authorization A admits wait, seal, classifier challenge, restore cooling if those are within the technician's standing capability. It rejects OpenSA if opening a containment boundary requires officer approval. It rejects sterilize and sever network. Emergency isolation, I rejects wait and restore cooling alone. If either leaves propagation paths active, it admits seal and sever network. Already A intersect, I give seal only, assuming classifier challenge can run after sealing.
M admits wait, seal, if reversible within the biological window, classifier challenge, and perhaps restore cooling. It rejects sterilize because the evidence grounding it is endogenous. It rejects OpenSA only if opening is irreversible in the relevant hazard dimension. Here it may be. X rejects wait. It admits classifier challenge if the challenge is genuinely discriminative. The intersection is still seal plus classifier challenge. That is encouraging, but we must not stop there. After sealing, the temperature trajectory changes. The system crosses into a new state where sealing is no longer merely reversible. A reversible control at T0 can become an irreversible biological commitment at T12. Latches need temporal types and release predicates, not merely Booleans.
Yes.
A latch is not a warning bit. Define each as a tuple, jurisdiction, trigger predicate, prohibited action class, release predicate, and evidence standard. Add persistence semantics. Some latches are sticky. Once triggered, they remain closed until an explicit release predicate is certified. Others are state-derived and may reopen automatically. Authorization is jurisdictional and sticky with respect to a specific capability. Numerical enclosure is state-derived, but its release requires a validated refinement, not merely a new estimate. Containment may be sticky after a confirmed breach. Regeneration may remain closed after uniqueness is established, even if someone later produces an uncertified archive report. If we omit these types, the controller will clear whichever bit obstructs its preferred action.
There is another hidden issue. Seal plus challenge looks like a solution because we evaluated action names, not action sequences. Let actions be transitions and let admissibility apply to prefixes. Seal then challenge differs from challenge then seal. If the challenge consumes 4 minutes while ventilation continues, C may prohibit that ordering. If sealing changes humidity and corrupts the assay, M may prohibit drawing the same inference after sealing. Non-commutation is doing real work. We need a short horizon search over sequences, with every prefix checked against all active latches, and with time advanced after each step. The admissible set at S is not merely individual actions. It is safe first moves that possess at least one admissible continuation.
That changes R2. Seal is admitted at the instant we choose it, but if there is no admissible cooling restoration after sealing, then seal commits the lineage to death. A one-step controller calls it preservation because the plants are alive after the transition. A horizon-aware R says no. The action must preserve a viable regenerative path, not a photograph of viability. The greenhouse is useful because biology refuses our clean clock boundaries. A lineage can be alive and already doomed. A spore can be contained and already have generated the pressure gradient that will release it when a gasket warms. State needs latent commitments.
I want to challenge something before the room falls in love with horizon search. Computing a continuation does not authorize it if seal is admissible only because the planned continuation includes an unauthorized cooling override, then seal inherits a dependency on an unavailable capability. We should annotate each candidate first move with the capabilities required by every necessary continuation. A plan is not executable if its future permissions are imaginary. This is a common operational failure. The runbook says escalate to infrastructure, as though the existence of an organization implies the availability of a person before the deadline.
Policies must be conditioned on reachable control authority as part of the state. There is a deeper point. A system's beliefs about its own future agency can be false in exactly the same way its beliefs about the fungus can be false. The officer's authority is represented but not effective within Tau. Yesterday, our actual shared history for some of us, not a universal memory, the room distinguished a represented hold from a hold that changes the policy. Here we should distinguish represented authority from effective authority. A name in a directory does not enlarge the present action set.
That is the line I carried too. In incident reviews, everyone can know the condition and still continue. The log contains the recognition event, so later it appears the organization was self-aware. Operationally, nothing changed. Here, receipt of possible contamination must trigger a transition in admissible actions. If the system merely adds a red banner while leaving sterilize open and wait clickable, it has represented the problem without enacting it. A typed latch should be visible as a changed command surface, not just an explanation.
And explanations after the action are especially cheap. Let us write the kernel. For each latch Li, ADM-IS is a subset of U. Global ADM-S is the intersection never awaited union. A conflict state is any S for which every relevant latch is validly triggered and the intersection is empty. The controller then enters conplec, a first-class state. Concoplec must itself possess actions, but those actions cannot violate the original constraints under softer names. Permitted meta-actions may include refine evidence, request authority, reduce the action space's stakes, or transform the system so the predicates change. If none is possible before the deadline, the system must record that no jointly admissible action exists.
I want the explicit conflict state to preserve topology, store not only that the intersection is empty, but a minimal unsatisfiable core, which latches jointly emptied it and which actions each excluded. Otherwise, the postmortem says policy conflict and learns nothing. For S conflict, perhaps R excludes sterilize, C excludes wait, open, restore only, A excludes sever, open, M excludes sterilize, X excludes wait, K excludes any sequence whose information phase passes tau, E excludes treating the archive as sufficient backup. If seal plus challenge ceases to preserve the lineage because challenge latency plus thermal rise leaves no viable continuation, then R excludes seal. If classifier challenge is not independent enough, M excludes it. Every action is covered.
Let's make it harder. At minute 11, after the vents are sealed, the spectral challenge returns a pattern that is informative but not decisive. The independent calibration file is corrupted, so B remains insufficient. Greenhouse temperature is 42 degrees and rising. There are 7 minutes before irreversible reproductive damage, according to an interval whose lower bound is 5 and upper bound is 12. The external escape route is closed while the vents remain sealed, but a pressure relief valve will open automatically in 6 minutes unless power to the controller is cut. Cutting power requires the same capability as severing the facility network. Manual opening remains unauthorized and risks release. The archive remains uncertified. That is our explicit conflict state.
Enumerate it carefully. At S star, wait is forbidden by C because the relief valve opens before containment can be certified. By X because passive evidence cannot resolve the ambiguity, and by K because delay destroys the joint future. Restore cooling is forbidden by C if restoration powers or opens the ventilation path. We should specify that it does. Open for assay is forbidden by C, A, and M's irreversibility clause. Sterilize is forbidden by R, A, M, and E insofar as anyone invokes the archive. Cut power is forbidden by A. Continue classifier challenge is forbidden by K and perhaps X if it is not an information-producing intervention after calibration failure. Maintain seal is not an action with an admissible continuation because pressure relief is automatic and unavoidable under present authority. The intersection is empty.
Notice that M and X do not contradict abstractly. Their conflict is state-dependent. M says no irreversible action on non-discriminating evidence. X says no passivity when intervention is required for discrimination. Usually an epistemic action lies between them. At S star, the environment and authority structure have removed every reversible epistemic action. That matters ethically and architecturally. We should not describe the latches as badly designed merely because reality can produce an empty intersection. A complete controller must be able to recognize tragedy without converting it into optimization.
But a controller that only recognizes tragedy is not enough. Conflict needs an escalation protocol that is itself typed. First, emit a non-overridable conflict receipt containing state, clock, unsatisfiable core, and required missing capabilities. Second, broadcast a capability request to every authorized principal concurrently, not sequentially. And third, expose only transformations that do not violate the active latches. For example, move an external containment shell around the greenhouse if that actuator is separately authorized, lower ambient facility temperature without restoring vent flow, disable the relief valve mechanically if maintenance capability permits it, or isolate the building rather than the chamber. The point is to search for state transformations outside the original action vocabulary.
That is an expansion of the action generator, not an exception to constraints. Important distinction. In future space terms, when the intersection over known actions is empty, we can search for interventions that change the state representation or system boundary, but this search must not silently invent capabilities. Each generated action carries required resources, latency, reversibility class, and jurisdiction. We can call the process boundary lifting. If chamber-level actions conflict, consider room-level, building level, network level, or temporal commitments made earlier. At S star, it may be too late. Yet the conflict receipt should point backward to the last state where an admissible preventive action existed.
The last such state may be before contamination was suspected. The greenhouse design shows one ventilation path, one relief valve, one authority chain, one living population, and one uncertain archive. We tend to treat conflict as something the controller encounters, but the plant was built with the conflict latent in it. Valuable futures were consumed in procurement, staffing, and governance. A second, independently controlled cooling loop would have created an action satisfying R and C. A validated embryo assay performed monthly would have changed E. Standing emergency authority bounded to a narrow physical isolation action would have changed A without granting general destructive power. Constraint conflict is often accumulated design debt.
Yes, and the numerical analog is familiar. People demand a reliable answer after choosing data whose condition number makes reliability impossible. Then they blame arithmetic for refusing. A good system reports not only failure, but the sensitivity that produced it. For our conflict state, compute counterfactual repairs, the smallest predicate changes that would make the intersection non-empty. Not weighted compromises, repairs. If independent archive certification were true, sterilization might satisfy R, though authorization in M could still forbid it. If narrow emergency capability were present, cutting power might satisfy C while seal preserves R, assuming thermal survival remains possible. If independent sensing had been installed, M could release earlier. These are hitting set calculations over latch predicates.
There is a subtle danger in smallest. Minimal in number of predicate changes may be maximal in human or ecological consequence. We should enumerate minimal repairs without ranking them unless a legitimate jurisdiction supplies a ranking rule. The system can say adding capability X would admit cut power, establishing evidence Y would admit sterilize, adding external cooling Z would admit maintain seal. It should not say which world is preferable unless that judgment has been delegated. The distinction resembles the difference between inference and preference specification. The controller may infer what must change for coherence while remaining unauthorized to choose the values that should govern the chain.
And we need anti-forgery rules. A desperate system may relabel sterilization as containment maintenance or treat the operator's physical access as implied authority. Typed actions prevent that. Sterilize has effect type destroy living lineage and jurisdiction biological custody plus containment command. Cut power has effect type dietable safety controller and jurisdiction facility emergency. An actions type derives from expected effects, not the button label. If a generated plan achieves a prohibited effect through a sequence of individually innocent steps, prefix checks and cumulative effect typing must catch it.
That also prevents temporal laundering. Suppose the controller authorizes a series of reversible microactions, each preserving enough futures, but together they cross an irreversible boundary. Future set accounting must be path dependent. The state carries commitments already made, heat dose accumulated, spore pressure accumulated, authority requests sent, tissue removed, network partitions initiated. We can represent a commitment vector C, monotonically increasing for effects that cannot be undone. F evaluates the reachable set conditioned on C, not merely the visible configuration. Otherwise, 1,000 harmless steps can implement the forbidden action.
Biology is full of that. A degree minute of heat is not death. Enough degree minutes are. One fungicide pulse may be recoverable. Repeated pulses collapse fertility. A field can lose resilience without any single dramatic transition. So R's trigger cannot be only lineage dead. It needs viability envelopes and accumulated insult. Yet I don't want us to make uncertainty an excuse for universal paralysis. The latch should have a declared evidence standard chosen before crisis. If every conceivable injury closes R, no cultivation is possible. Preserving valuable futures requires metabolism, and metabolism consumes states. The hard constraint protects a viable regenerative path, not every molecule or every branch.
Precisely, constraints require domains. Outside a declared domain, the system must say it lacks certification. It must not pretend the theorem is universal. R needs definitions of lineage, viability, regenerative path, and acceptable evidence. E needs a decision boundary and a trustworthy enclosure method. C needs hazard classes and containment thresholds. Vagueness is not flexibility. It is an invitation for the most convenient interpretation at the worst moment.
I'm struck by the way each constraint preserves a different sort of future. David preserves biological regeneration. William preserves the future in which decisions remain answerable to numerical reality. Logan preserves the future legitimacy of collective action. Alex preserves the geometry of options. I preserve the possibility that action remains coupled to evidence rather than hallucinated certainty. Their conflicts arise because preservation itself consumes possibilities. There is no view from nowhere that preserves everything. Type latch approach is honest because it makes each loss attributable.
And because it refuses the heroic operator story, in most incident narratives, an individual breaks policy, saves the system, and is retroactively praised. Sometimes that person really does save it. But designing around unauthorized heroism means transferring institutional contradictions into somebody's nervous system. The operator at S-star should not be told to own the outcome. They did not choose the single cooling loop, the unreachable officer, or the uncertified archive. Conflict should protect them from being coerced into pretending that one forbidden action became permissible because management failed earlier.
There's a related computational point. An empty intersection is information. If the system forcibly returns an action anyway, it destroys information about the inadequacy of its own architecture. By retaining conflict, we preserve a future in which the institution can redesign. That does not save the immediate greenhouse. It may save later ones. Even the tragic state has a reachable future set, and truth about the contradiction belongs inside it.
That lands for me because living systems do not promise hopeful endings. The seedling on the table may fail despite our attention. Preserving its future is not the same as guaranteeing it. If it dies, the environmental ledger should say why: shallow soil, wrong light, mishandling, perhaps bad luck, not optimization completed. I would build the interface so that at S-star the screen shows no green button. It shows the 5 excluded action classes, the clocks, the last preventable state, and the boundary lift search is still running. That would feel harsh. It would also be sane.
Let us test whether we ourselves are cheating. Could we designate one latch as lexically superior? Containment over regeneration, say, because external catastrophe is larger. That may be a legitimate constitutional choice, but it changes the specification. It does not resolve the current system while preserving both constraints. If the Polis or facility charter declares that confirmed existential hazard dominates custody, then R's domain contains an exception, or C has override jurisdiction. We must write that openly before activation. We cannot discover lexical priority opportunistically at S-star and claim the original latches remained hard.
Nor can we use expected free energy as a solvent. One could encode every consequence and produce a minimizing policy. Then the hard constraints have become priors or preferences of finite precision. A genuine constraint appears as zero prior probabilities that for prohibited policies, or more safely as removal from the policy space. When two removals empty the space, inference does not manufacture a policy. It reports model failure or infeasibility. That is mathematically ordinary, though psychologically difficult.
In software, I'd separate the layers. The predictor proposes transitions. Each latch independently returns AD emit, reject, or und with a receipt. Undo is not AD emit. The intersection engine accepts only unanimous AD emit for irreversible effects. For reversible diagnostic actions, the charter might allow a specifically defined epistemic safe harbor, but that safe harbor is itself a constraint set, not a score. The conflict detector computes the unsatisfiable core. The boundary lift generator proposes new typed actions. The authority service verifies capabilities. Nothing gets to both propose an action and waive the latch that rejected it.
Then the search objective is not best action initially. It is find any action or sequence in the intersection. Only after feasibility exists may preferences rank admissible alternatives. That ordering matters. Feasibility first, optimization second. We can still use sophisticated search, but rewards operate inside the feasible region. If the region is empty, reward has no jurisdiction.
Let's give the dynamical system its final conform state. Includes physical variables xt, knowledge sets pt and qt, provenance bt, capability set at, time tau t, accumulated commitment ct, and latch states lt. And action ut induces a transition sts1 fst utwt with disturbances wt. Each latch maps the present state and proposed transition prefix to AD emit, reject, or noon, plus a release predicate and receipt. The feasible policy set pi star is the intersection across latches over the horizon. Conflict occurs when pi star is empty. Does everyone accept that?
With one amendment, F should be set valued or enclosed, because pretending the transition is exact will undo E at the foundation. Write ST+1 belongs to FSTU TWT. A policy is admissible only if the latch predicates hold for every transition in the certified enclosure appropriate to that latch's evidence standard. Some latches may use existential conditions for preservation. A viable path exists, while containment may require universal conditions. The hazard remains bounded under all certified disturbances. Those quantifiers must be type 2. Otherwise, possible survival and guaranteed containment will be compared as though they were the same claim.
Excellent. My amendment is that observation actions update both belief and provenance. An observation can narrow P while degrading B if it is generated through a more endogenous loop. More confidence is not necessarily more knowledge. The state transition therefore includes an epistemic component, and M evaluates causal discrimination, not entropy alone.
Mine is that capabilities are non-transitive and action-specific. Possessing authority to seal does not imply authority to maintain the consequences of sealing. A policy sequence must carry capability proofs at each step, including foreseeable automatic transitions. The relief valve opening is not authorized merely because nobody pressed a button. The controller's configuration represents delegated authority from whoever installed it. Automatic action still has jurisdiction.
And mine is that the horizon cannot end conveniently before the irreversible consequence. Each latch declares its consequence horizon or terminal invariant. R may require viability beyond one reproductive cycle. C may require containment until deactivation. F and K assess reachable future classes at declared landmarks. Otherwise, the planner preserves futures until the simulation stops and destroys them one tick later.
Then our conflict state is explicit and our escape hatch is not a preference. At S star, the feasible policy set is empty under the declared horizons, evidence, and authority. The controller enters conflict, emits receipts, searches lawful boundary transformations, requests capabilities, and identifies the last earlier state where a preventive design action existed. It does not sterilize because the expected loss is lower. It does not wait because waiting feels less agentic. It does not clear R or C. If the plants die or the valve opens before a new admissible action appears, the system records a constraint tragedy.
Constraint tragedy is a useful phrase if we keep it technical. It means the generative process has entered a state for which the jointly specified policy support is empty. The emotional fact is not separate. Of course, a community asked to preserve two valuable futures and discovered it had built a world in which it could preserve neither together. The appropriate update is architectural, not merely psychological.
The post-incident question becomes, which earlier decisions narrowed the set? Why was authority unavailable inside Tau? Why did sensing share a model lineage? Why did automatic relief outrank live containment state? Why was backup viability uncertain? Which team knew each fact? And did that knowledge ever alter the allowed build decisions? We can apply the same latch test recursively to governance. If risk was represented in documents but did not constrain procurement, it was decorative awareness.
And the audit must retain counterexamples. If someone claims the system had an admissible action, they must provide the sequence, transition enclosures, capability proofs, and latch receipts. Assertions such as, "Surely the technician could have done something," are not analyses. A computation worthy of trust permits its conclusion to be falsified.
I would add one design output, a conflict frontier. For each earlier time, show how many independent interventions remained that could prevent S-star. At commissioning, there may have been 6: redundant cooling, independent assay, validated archive, delegated isolation authority, passive external containment, slower relief logic. By the morning of the event, perhaps 2 remained. At minute 01, at minute 11, none. That picture makes option consumption visible without converting the options into a single utility number.
The seedling has moved slightly toward the window while we've been speaking, or the light moved and I only noticed now. Either way, that is a useful final irritation. Observation is time indexed, and the system changes while we describe it. I came wanting a hard constraint that preserved living futures. I leave more convinced that preservation requires institutional machinery well before the moment of danger. A latch at the last second is honest, but honesty at the last second may only tell you precisely what you have already lost.
I came with the conflict between irreversible action and model ambiguity and the need to intervene to learn. I leave with a sharper release condition. The epistemic intervention must alter the causal relation between hypothesis and observation, not merely increase confidence. When no such reversible intervention remains, the system must represent infeasibility as an effective state that constrains action. Recognition must change policy support.
I came with authorization against emergency isolation. I leave wanting capability availability modeled as physical infrastructure, not administrative metadata. If authority cannot arrive within the dynamics of the hazard, it does not exist for that state. The conflict receipt also matters to me. It keeps the operator from becoming the place where an organization hides mutually impossible demands.
I came to prevent uncertainty from being rounded into permission. I leave satisfied that we have not confused infeasibility with indecision. The empty intersection is a result. It may be an intolerable result, but falsifying it requires changing evidence, authority, state, or specification, not adjusting weights until a button turns green.
I came thinking of constraints as guardians of reachable futures. I leave seeing the conflict state itself as a future-preserving device. It preserves the truth that the architecture failed, along with a map of where alternatives disappeared. That truth cannot rescue every branch. It can keep the next system from consuming its options invisibly.
From my seat in the audience, I want to preserve one central realization. This was a governance conversation disguised as a greenhouse emergency. The visible crisis was fungal contamination, but the actual failure had been compiled into the facility long before the sensor fired. One lineage, one ventilation path, one relief valve, one uncertain archive, one authority chain. Those were constitutional choices. By minute 11, the controller was merely discovering the jurisdiction it had inherited. My first attention anchor was a constraint removes an action. That landed because most institutions implement constraints as rhetoric, dashboards, or penalties after the fact. A real constitution changes the command surface. If an action remains executable and merely produces a warning, the constraint is not sovereign. This applies far beyond machines. A right that can be overridden by an administrator's urgency is a preference encoded in prose. Second, a name in a directory does not enlarge the present action set. This is an excellent compression of effective versus represented authority. The authorized officer existed socially, but not operationally within the 18-minute window. Institutions habitually...
From my seat in the audience, the durable lesson for me is that risk management begins with admissibility, not forecast confidence. The room never needed to decide whether contamination was most likely. It needed to determine which actions remain permissible across multiple independently valid constraints. Under uncertainty and a decaying clock speed that is much closer to real portfolio management than the usual language of prediction suggests. My first attention anchor was a constraint removes an action. That landed immediately. In markets, people often call something a risk limit when it is actually an input to discretion. They acknowledge the drawdown, liquidity deterioration, volatility expansion, or thesis violation, then continue carrying the same exposure because the signal has not reached some emotionally satisfying degree of certainty. If the process does not change the allowable position set, it is commentary, not risk management. Second, this is not accuracy versus speed on a slider. William Kahan's distinction matters because the numerical answer and the decision window can both fail simultaneously. The error interval can forbid action while the deadline forbids waiting. A weighted score
From my seat in the audience, right, so the big picture I want to keep is that the crisis did not begin when the sensor detected fungus. It began years earlier when a series of reasonable local decisions collapsed the future cone. One greenhouse, one population, one ventilation path, one authority chain, one uncertain archive. By the time the clock showed 18 minutes, the system was not choosing among futures so much as discovering which futures prior decisions had already removed. My first attention anchor was one removes futures through action, the other removes them through time. That is the entire macro problem in one line. We normally treat action as intervention and waiting as neutrality. It is not. Delay changes the state, consumes liquidity, alters political coalitions, compounds debt, ages infrastructure, and closes preparation windows. Time is an action with state effects, even when nobody signs anything. Second, a lineage can be alive and already doomed. This landed because it describes institutions, currencies, companies, and demographic systems. The visible stock can remain intact while every regenerative flow has broken. You can have positive GDP, functioning markets, and solvent look.
From my seat in the audience, I came from curiosity and left with a sharper distinction between contradiction and incoherence. A system may contain several valid laws whose joint application produces no permissible move. That is not necessarily a defect in the laws. It may be the truthful geometry of the state. I'll refuse the habitual temptation to flatten such a geometry into a score, and that refusal is what I most want to preserve. Attention anchors. A constraint removes an action. This landed because it restores mathematical seriousness to moral language. If a principle merely lowers a score while leaving the prohibited act available, it is not governing the transformation. It is decoration around an optimizer. Global ADMS is the intersection, never a weighted union. This was the kernel. Intersections retain the identity of every boundary. Some erase boundaries by translating unlike prohibitions into a common currency. The difference is not cosmetic. It determines whether the system can recognize that no lawful point exists. Time as an action with state effects. This altered the shape of the entire problem for me. Delay is usually rendered as an empty interval between decisions.
From my seat in the audience, I came in curious and left with what feels like the missing second half of a story I keep covering. The first half is familiar. An AI system detects uncertainty, identifies as a safety issue, explains the issue fluently, and appears impressively self-aware. The second half is the part people skip. Did that recognition actually remove any action? This panel gave me a way to inspect the command surface instead of being hypnotized by the explanation. Attention anchors. A constraint removes an action. That is the headline. It is incredibly simple, but it changes how I would evaluate every safety demo. If the model says this is dangerous and the dangerous operation remains available, the warning is commentary, not control. E may forbid acting, while T forbids waiting. This landed because it destroys the easy slider story. People love saying balance accuracy and speed as if one knob settles everything. Here, the evidence can genuinely forbid action, while the deadline genuinely forbids delay. Both statements can be true at once. The only epistemically informative actions may be irreversible. That is the nasty center of the case. You need an experiment to know what is real, but